Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI121 in fall 2021. This is Flush Toilets of the Bronze Age, the Indus Valley Civilization. So as per usual, we're going to start with some questions. These are things that the lecture is going to address. Make sure that you can answer them after you go through your notes. So why is our understanding of Harappan society so limited? What factors work against forming a more complete picture? How do the Harappan cities compare to Uruk, and what sort of regional differences do we see? And what is the role of the local environment in creating these differences? So as I mentioned in the lecture on Uruk, these first two lectures are a sort of comparative case study, looking at the way urban society differs in different parts of the early ancient world. You are, of course, reading Annalee Newitz's book, Four Lost Cities, for your book review, and so these should be considered sort of preparatory work, getting you thinking in the right direction to be approaching that book. So let's give you some basics on the Harappan civilization. And they, again, the name is a bit confusing. They're called Harappans after sort of the key type city that's found, but they're also called the Indus Valley Civilization because that's where they are. So we are looking at a civilization that developed on the Indian subcontinent. It happened sometime between around 3300 BCE is the origins of the civilization. They lasted until about 1300. What's called the mature phase existed between 2600 and 1900 BCE. It's the largest of the Bronze Age civilizations in two ways. Firstly, the population. They may have had up to 5 million people living in Harappan cities. Secondly, the geographic spread, because it covered nearly a third of modern India. So it's twice the size of the Egyptian or Mesopotamian civilizations. Now, it was officially discovered by Europeans in 1924. Sir John Marshall, who was a British archaeologist, announced finding Harappa and Mohenjo Daro in the Illustrated London News. But there had been decades of work on the sites beforehand. They just hadn't been sure what to make of them because it so totally redefined concepts of history on the subcontinent. Now, after Marshall publicized his trip to these cities, it came to his attention that similar artifacts had actually been found in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, I mentioned an archaeologist by the name of Bhandarkar on the slideshow. He was an Indian archaeologist, and he had actually visited Mohenjo Daro in 1911 to 1912, but he thought it was much more recent because it all looked too modern to him. The bricks, the sewer system. It really had not occurred to him that the city could be as old as it actually was. So as the cities are investigated, more sites are found. 37 Harappan sites were identified by 1947, and today we know over 1,000. And they range from tiny villages to cities of 50,000 people. Now, there are specific challenges in studying the Harappans. While they are a river-based civilization, like Mesopotamia, they do have sophisticated architecture and city plans. There is one major difference. Their writing system has not been deciphered. I mean, there isn't as much textual material to begin with, but even if there was, it wouldn't make any difference because we can't read it. Now, this may change. There have been massive improvements in cryptography and computer science over the last little while, and they've given us hope that we might actually decipher a number of untranslatable scripts. Maybe the Harappan script, maybe Linear A in the Mediterranean. We can keep our fingers crossed, but there hasn't been any, great developments there yet. So who were the Harappans? There's been some interesting work done on population genetics and migrations. Current consensus is that the Harappans arose from the combination of two population groups around 10,000 BCE, a local population of hunter-gatherers and a population of West Asian hunter-gatherers who wound up on the subcontinent before the development of agriculture. Now, How agriculture arose on the subcontinent is a matter of great debate. Some argue that it arose independently, some say it was imported from Western Asia. Certainly, it was facilitated through the natural flooding of the Indus River. This allowed for the cultivation of numerous cereal crops, and we actually think cotton as well in certain cities. We know they also raised animals. There's evidence of cattle, water buffalo, donkeys, and elephants. What's really interesting, though, is that there is some evidence that a lot of the people who lived in Harappan cities may actually have been migrants. Some of our more recent studies on the teeth of people in Harappan graves have allowed scholars to establish which of the people in the graves grew up drinking local water. And from the graves that have been studied, it seems that many Harappan women were married to men from elsewhere. So what does this say about their society? Did men come to live with the families of their wives? That would certainly be very different than Mesopotamia. At the very least, this suggests that there was plenty of migration into Harappan society. Now, even without their writing, we can tell that the urban economy was complex. There's evidence for a large number of different crafts, metalworking, including copper and bronze for tools and gold for jewelry. They seem to have been really into bead making, like this was a major focus for certain Harappan cities. There's a lot of small-scale artwork, so terracotta figures, usually of birds, animals, or human beings, but small sculptures. They're not into monumental sculptures. Their art is the sort of thing you might display on a table, not in front of a building. Now, there's hard to argue looking at what Harappan cities were like, that there was any kind of overarching central authority. It's likely that the regional centers were independent. Certainly there would have been local hierarchies, but we don't think it was a unified empire or anything like that. The differences between Mesopotamian architecture and Harappan architecture are pretty significant. In Harappan cities, there are very few pieces of evidence for social distinctions in architecture. There are no apparent palaces or royal tombs. There are no fancy Harappan graves with loads of grave goods. So you can't identify elite graves. So it makes it very hard to see how this civilization developed as well. I mean, evidence from the early period is very scant, and excavation is hard. The river environment makes it problematic because there are deposits of silt that cover the earlier strata. Now, we do know they had a common writing system because even though we can't read it, we can see the similar writing in between different sites. And we can also tell they had a uniform system of weights and measures that was very precise. So why develop something that precise? Well, obviously because they're a trading civilization. But what's really interesting is that they had similar everyday technology. And by that, I mean the sanitation system. The sanitation system is a marker of Harappan civilization, and I'll talk more about that a bit later. Now, that being said, there was some considerable diversity between different centers. So Mohenjo Daro, for instance, has no cemetery that's been found, at least not yet. Dolavira, on the other hand, has a huge cemetery. So why do we see the differences in funeral rites? Now, back to the script for a minute. There's been some debate very recently about the Harappan script. Some fringe types suggest that it's not actually a linguistic script, but the equivalent of traffic signs. I'm going to admit I don't get it. I've read a little bit about this theory. It just doesn't really make sense to me. Obviously, we can't know how fully developed their writing was, but it's likely that it came around about for reasons of commerce, as we saw in Uruk. Now, one of the more interesting things about Harappan society is that no significant number of military weapons have been found in archaeological exploration, and no evidence of war damage to any of the cities. I mean, you see this in ash layers. If a city is invaded and burned, there is usually evidence. You see human bones, evidence for collapsed buildings. But what's also interesting is that there is no depiction of war armies, or prisoners on seals or pottery. There aren't even any clear images of rulers, and so this is very different than Mesopotamian art, where that was a major focus. What does this mean? Did they just not fight? Possibly they didn't have many people who needed to be fought. Harappan cities are located sort of in an area between mountains, an eastern desert, and the southern sea, so they're shielded geographically in a way. But they also don't seem to have waged wars against each other. Was there no shortage of food or resources? Did they just not have reason? Now, there is some minor evidence for possible fighting in early Harappan civilization. There are some ash or debris deposits, but they might be simply from fires because they are not extensive. Most cities did have walls and watchtowers, and although we see some weapons discovered, they're fairly primitive. So when you see a knife or a spear or an arrowhead, how do you know if it was used against humans or just for hunting? You don't. Now, we do have one seal that shows two men spearing each other, while a woman, or possibly a goddess, stands in the middle holding their free hands. This doesn't actually look like a scene from warfare. It looks like some type of religious thing. It doesn't have to be representative of reality. Now, in terms of religion, we don't have any buildings that are clearly and unmistakably temples. There are only hints of their religious practices as a whole. There's some evidence on seals. There's a figure that looks almost like Shiva. There's a woman standing under a tree with heart-shaped leaves with someone kneeling in front of her. There's also rituals that are carried out in front of a unicorn. There's also a small sculpture of a man called the Priest King. So, there's a little bit of evidence that they had some sort of religion. We just don't know what it comprised of. Certainly there's some cultural continuity with later beliefs, but nothing clear and obvious. We won't have that until the script is deciphered at the very least, and possibly not even then. Certainly, again, there's no monumental sculptures of kings or gods. Their art is miniature in scale. They seem to have really liked depicting ordinary people in different everyday poses and settings. Everything from holding babies to kneading bread. Very real world stuff. Let me give you an example. Oh, she's probably later in the image. We'll get to the dancing girl. Sorry. Now, Mohenjo Daro, I wanted to talk about briefly. It's the most famous of the Harappan sites because it is the most extensively excavated. It covered about 80 hectares. It was excavated in the 20s and 30s with work that continued after World War II. It is a site that's in a great deal of danger. This is due to what we call capillary action. The brick buildings actually suck subterranean water upwards and into the bricks, and the salts that the water leaves behind corrodes the buildings. It's not clear how best to protect these buildings, so things are a little bit dicey with Mohenjo Daro. A few years ago, there was a small fuss on the archaeological internet about the local government deciding to rebury Mohenjo Daro to protect it. That's not actually what happened. What they did is they reduced access. They wanted to keep the rest of it unexcavated until they can do a better job. Now, a former student of mine actually visited Mohenjo Daro about 6 years ago, and he said that it was in shocking shape. There was a lot of graffiti. It was very run down. And that's a shame because it is an exceptional site. So it has large architecture that can be interpreted as monumental. Something called by archaeologists the Citadel, which is probably not a good name for it. After all, we don't have evidence that there was any kind of a centralized ruler here. How do we know what this higher building was for? Certainly, the lower town is laid out on a strict grid pattern. The streets are oriented to the cardinal points of the compass. And the grid pattern is quite unusual if you compare it to Mesopotamian cities. There are even a few very wide side streets where carts could have passed each other side by side. And what this tells us is that this system of weights and measures that we already knew was standard because of the nature of the buildings also extended to urban planning. So the bricks that are used to build are all in standard sizes. Where smaller bricks were needed, they were cut into smaller pieces. The ratio was always maintained, 1 to 2 to 4, thickness to width to length. The same proportion is seen in building design. Now, for a long time, the baked bricks would have been more resistant against water. We see them used in the drains as well that lined Harappan streets. And the drains also would carry away material from latrines in private houses. Hence the title of this lecture, Flush Toilets of the Bronze Age. Now, this is unique, this sanitation system, in that it extended even to private houses. The Mesopotamians and the Egyptians had nothing like this in terms of hygiene. And because it is so unusual, we're able to see where the Harappans built outposts in distant regions. So we know, for instance, there's a Harappan trade outpost in Mesopotamia because its sanitation system is so completely different than everything surrounding it. Now, I mentioned the citadel. Whatever it was some type of city center. It had larger buildings. It was raised above the rest of the city on a platform. It had a mud brick retaining wall. We don't know what went on in these buildings, and the excavators in the 1920s in particular were not at all careful about things like potsherds or animal bones, things that could have told us more about what was going on inside. Like at Uruk, they were more concerned with the architecture. We don't have a complete plan of the buildings because of erosion. There are also later occupation layers on top of it, including a 2nd century CE Buddhist monastery that was preserved. We do know that there may have been artisanal or industrial activity in certain areas of the citadel. One of the more interesting areas is what's called the Great Bath, which is connected again to the city drains. It was in the open air with steps on either side. I'll show you a picture in a moment. You can kind of see it there actually in the aerial shot. It's kind of right in the towards the right side, the middle of the picture. It was in the open air. It had steps on either end. It was surrounded by rooms of different sizes. The assumption is that it served some type of ritual purpose, but we're not sure. And the same is true of other buildings in the citadel. And there's one that archaeologists dubbed the Assembly Hall, for instance, because it had column bases dividing it into equal aisles. And it's similar to buildings in Egyptian and Persian sites that we know held large public gatherings. I think you can probably understand why it's a bit dicey to be ascribing names like that to buildings where we really have no idea what they were for, just because they look like buildings in other places. Now, in the lower town, the private houses are of different sizes, and some of them seemed quite comfortable. They had their own drains, their own wells, often had a central courtyard in the larger houses. There are obvious shops throughout the lower town. Potters, cloth makers, metal workers, bead makers. There's a whole variety of crafts represented. So this is a very complex urban society, and as much as it is different in some ways than Uruk, it has a lot in common with Uruk as well. So there are always going to be continuities, similarities in what urban life looks like, even as the local region and its particular challenges create some differences. So here's some images. This is a shot of the citadel of Mohenjo Daro, and an overhead shot of part of the lower town. Here we have the Great Bath, so that's a close-up. It would have been quite deep, which is interesting. And here's some different shots of the sanitation system and different parts of it. So in the top left-hand corner, that's a drain. Below it is a toilet. This sort of brick box with an opening on top. We see this throughout the city. It even seems to indicate that there were public toilets, as there are so many of them. And then on the other side, we've got examples of sump pots and latrines excavated in private houses. So it's highly unusual to see something like this from this period. And just think about what that means. Think about the fact that they cared enough about odor and hygiene to go to such extents to create a sanitation system? This tells us about their values, even if we're not sure what exactly it says. And there's the dancing girl. I knew I had her in there somewhere. So this is probably the most famous sculpture from Harappa. It gives you an idea of the basic look of the art. Some have speculated she might be a religious figure of some sort. Honestly, I just think she's really pretty. It's a neat little statue, this one. So what happens to the Harappans? Again, we're not entirely sure. Their civilization seems to have dissolved into local village-based cultures. This may have been due to environmental change, so floods or overgrazing. Perhaps one of the rivers started to dry up. We don't have any idea what kind of political or religious changes may have had influence, so there are factors we will never see. Again, what we do know is that there's almost no evidence of violence in the archaeological remains of the very late Harappan civilization. No layers of ash, only scattered evidence of any violence at all. I mean, by this I mean they have found a few skeletons with damage to the skulls. And how do we know that was warfare? We don't, especially with no other evidence. Could have just been a few people that were killed for whatever reason. So it's highly unlikely that the civilization was destroyed by invasion, and that was the traditional view. We're looking at a more complex picture that can only be filled in by future excavations and work. There seems to have been a slower process of decline in industrial production, also in long-distance trade. Over time, houses were less well maintained, as was the drainage system. In Mohenjo Daro, some of the later houses were made of broken or used bricks. Some bodies were left unburied. We have evidence of kilns built in the middle of streets. Pottery is no longer painted, it's just plain. But then again, there is also indications of some brief revivals of urban culture at different sites. There are some scholars who talk about a post-Harappan period. So it's not a linear process of decline, whatever it was. Again, possibly we're looking at the influence of climate change. If there was a drop in the monsoon rains, it would have made the region drier and damaged its agricultural capacity. There also were some very consequential earthquakes in this period, including at least one that altered the path of the Indus River. It turned a smaller river called the Gagar Hakra from a river that had its source in the Himalayas to a monsoonal river. So it's a river that only ran at certain times a year. And this affected a number of Harappan centers where they went from having a reliable source of water to a water supply that was dependent on rain. So people who look at genetic research suggested that the Harappans or their descendants actually moved east and south. There is a strong genetic proximity between them and modern South Indians. And it left a vacuum of sorts in the northwest that was filled by a new wave of migrants, the Aryans. And that is a whole other debate. It's a very, very heated debate. I don't really want to get into it in too much detail. There are a lot of even modern politics that have bearing on it. Certainly this new group brought the horse. They may have been horse nomads, as well as new languages and religions. All right, I should say something briefly. I did put it down. So what the Aryan debate is, it's basically an exercise in cultural chauvinism. Hindu nationalists began to claim that there was no Aryan migration, that they and the Harappans were the same people, and that they were entirely indigenous to the subcontinent. They would argue that the Harappans spoke Proto-Sanskrit and Proto-Indo-European languages actually spread from India to the west. So this was a politically motivated theory that was an attempt to portray Hinduism as native to the subcontinent. Is it true? Probably not. I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to opine with great fervor about it, but a lot of this stuff has been apparently debunked by those who do specialize in the period. And I just would point this out as an example of how dangerous prehistory can be, because it can be manipulated to serve all kinds of modern political purposes. All right, so I'm hoping that between the last two lectures, you now have some sense of the many factors that influence the early development of urban life. What should you take away from this? A lot of it is guesswork. There's not sufficient evidence in most cases to be concrete with any one interpretation. You should also keep in mind that regional differences were important. The local environment in particular was tremendously influential on what shape cities take. And finally, ancient society is very complex. And I would say that is one of the biggest lessons I want you to take away from the course as a whole. Just because they didn't have the knowledge and the technology that we do doesn't make them primitive or simple. In fact, quite the opposite. They had ways of adapting, ways of accommodating their circumstances and influencing the very land that they lived on that were quite complicated in many cases. We're going to see lots of evidence for that as the course goes on. Okay, so that will do it for this lecture. I hope you have enjoyed your first week's worth of topics, and I will see you all at the Zoom session.